Hey, this is Tom Webster, and this is Sounds Profitable for Wednesday, July 17th, 2024. What has your podcast got to lose? I just returned from a lovely cruise of the Italian coastline. I think I've come back with a cold, unfortunately. And while I'm busily trying to work out how Brian can live in Pacific time and I can live in Central European time without destroying our business, I remembered that I had a podcast to write. I had intended it to be a short podcast, but I may not have enough time to make it short. We'll see. There is a famously misattributed Mark Twain quote that goes something like this: "If I had had more time, I would have written a shorter letter." I don't know why this was linked to Twain other than he was a witty and pithy writer. But the actual origin of this thought was from the French mathematician and philosopher Blaise Pascal, who wrote in 1657, and I have to gear myself up for this, "Je n'ai fait celle-ci plus longue que parce que je n'ai pas eu le loisir de la faire plus courte." De la faire plus courte. My French teacher will kill me. My several years of Northern Maine franglais training tells me this translates to something like, "I've made this longer than usual because I have not had time to make it shorter." I'm a big fan of editing. The best, most listened to podcasts are generally pretty ruthlessly edited. I hear some creators who resist the whole concept of editing, and I get it. It takes a lot of time. The one reason I have never bought was the whole authenticity argument. There's authenticity, and then there's entertainment. If you have a guest who struggles to find the right word to express something in an interview, it's not doing them any favors to capture all of that verbal fumbling around. That's not the same thing as an emotional pause or a moment of nonverbal communication. That's just stuff that should have been edited out. Anytime I hear people say that they listen to podcasts at 1.5x speed or faster, I think that they're listening to podcasts that could have used a good edit. I have a book coming out imminently about making a better podcast, and I'll have more on that possibly next week. It has a whole chapter dedicated to editing, which shouldn't be controversial, but it is still a concept met with resistance. Still, here's an exercise I would love you to try, and you can save it for when you take a break or a pause in your podcasting schedule and really spend some time with it. Take an old episode that you've already published and get a high-quality human transcription mode that includes everything, even your ums and ahs. Spend some time reading it aloud. Could you imagine cutting anything? I bet you could, and I bet you'll cringe in some places. There are modern tools like Descript that allow you to do this kind of work in fairly short order, and it's work that's well worth doing. Often, when I'm asked by people, how long should my podcast be? I'll reply, semi-seriously, shorter than the last one. And I believe that's almost always the case. Still, there is such a thing as removing too much, and that is the second part of this exercise. Looking again at the transcript and the recording of an old show, what, if removed, would irreparably harm the show? What is the essence of the podcast that can't be taken away without causing serious damage? A few years ago, I wrapped a 6-year run as the co-host of The Marketing Companion, which was a very successful show I did with Mark Schaefer. It was reliably a top 20 marketing podcast with more than 1 million downloads. And when I would attend marketing conferences, more people talked to me about that podcast than almost anything else that I've done in the space. It was a bi-weekly discussion between Mark and I about something topical in the world of marketing, and we had a few recurring segments. We always started each show with a comedic bit that Mark would generally outline, and we would ad-lib around. Apropos of last week's podcast, he and I had fairly defined roles for those bits, with Mark very generously often serving as the straight man, while I generally made a fool of myself. Of course, there was a marketing-related topic each week, but here's a thing we learned that when we stripped the show down to that, it was no longer a show. I remember a stretch where Mark took a trip to Easter Island, which was going to take him out of pocket for anywhere from 3 weeks to infinity. Does anyone even know where Easter Island is? So I was charged with doing the show by myself, i.e. stripping away Mark. I couldn't do it. I tried. It absolutely sucked. I ended up roping my wife, Tamsin, into co-hosting with me because I knew we could have the same kind of repartee that Mark and I had. The show ended up sounding great. I don't even remember the topic. Mark was at first taken aback by my decision, but later, when he had to do the same, he experienced the same thing that I did. The banter, repartee, and the comedy bits, they were the show, not the marketing. Strip away the marketing talk, and we still had a show. Strip away our characters? We did not. You find out really quickly what matters and doesn't matter to your show if you experiment with taking it away. I've written before in this space about my love for the life advice segment of the Ryan Russillo podcast. Take that away, and it's a sports podcast. It's a really good one, but not as distinct, surely. So next time you take a break from the show, try and deconstruct it a bit. Would it be harmed if you removed something, or would it sharpen your focus? All of this brings me to one of my favorite quotes of all time, and one that 100% applies to me. Back in 1919, someone asked President Woodrow Wilson how long he spent writing his speeches, back when presidents wrote their own. He replied, "That depends on the length of the speech. If it is a 10-minute speech, it takes me all of 2 weeks to prepare it. If it's a half-hour speech, it takes me a week. If I can talk as long as I want to, it requires no preparation at all. I'm ready now." Now, this is over 1,000-word podcast, which is what I had time to do this week. Given more, I'm sure I could have cut it to 400. The hardest speech I ever gave was a Pachachka talk that was strictly time-limited to 5 minutes, with slides that advanced automatically every 20 seconds. Compared to that, a 1-hour keynote is a breeze. I'm ready now. But the discipline of making your show as short as humanly possible, while retaining what is truly important, is guaranteed to shorten the time it takes to connect with your audience. And with so many choices, every second counts. I'm Tom Webster. Thanks for listening to this article, What Has Your Podcast Got to Lose? The show is hosted by Spreaker. I'll see you next week.